This is a video on how to replace a headlight bulb on a 2011 Ninja 250. We're going to go through every step in detail, starting with removing the side fairings, then the radiator fairing, and then the upper fairing. It is possible to replace headlight bulbs without taking off the side fairings by reaching your hand like so. But it's very difficult to do this if you don't know what you're looking at, and there's a high probability that spiders could be present in this area. Therefore, I recommend removing the fairings. We will begin by removing the right fairing. In order to remove the right fairing, we must first remove the right side cover. There is one Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. Keep your hardware in an organizer to prevent loss. This is a very inexpensive DeWalt organizer purchased at Home Depot. It is compact and has 2 halves, one used for the right fairing hardware and the other for the left fairing hardware. The dividers can be repositioned. Now we will remove the second large hex bolt located at the middle of the bike. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab on the connector. You may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And there are 2 more hex bolts at the front of the bike, which are screwed into well nuts. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it is removed from its threads. Keep track of the nut plate. Sometimes the nut plate will be clamped on tightly, other times it will fall off. This is what the nut plate looks like. The bolt screws in like so. If the plate does fall off, be sure to keep it in your organizer. There are 3 small plastic rivets that secure the radiator fairing against the side and front fairings. You will only need to remove the lower 2. The third upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece raised up. Notice that in this configuration the teeth are not flared out, and thus the rivet is not activated. After the rivet is installed, it is activated by pushing the middle piece inward like so. Notice that the teeth are flared out, which means the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, the middle piece is pushed further in like so. Notice that the teeth are not flared out, which means the rivet has been deactivated. To reset the rivet, simply push the middle piece back out. Now we will remove the second rivet. Again, the third rivet does not need to be removed. It connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing, not the side fairing. There are 3 large rivets at the bottom of the fairings that hold the right and left fairings together. These rivets are designed differently from the small rivets. To remove them, use a flathead screwdriver to take out the inner part of the rivet, and then the remaining part will be easy to free from the hole in the fairings. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece removed. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is deactivated. Once the primary piece is installed in the fairings, the inner piece is pushed into it. Notice that the teeth cannot be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, simply pull the middle piece out with a flathead screwdriver. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inward again, which means that the rivet is deactivated and can easily be removed. Here is the second large rivet. And the third large rivet. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. The 2 hex bolts removed previously screw into them. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. If you're interested in how these well nuts work, here's a diagram. The rubber has metal threading inside it that the bolts screw into. As the bolt rotates in the threads, the end of the well nut moves inward, flaring out the rubber and creating a tight seal on the surface. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. This is where the pad is supposed to be located. You can see the sticker residue. and this is the pad. It protects the gas tank from friction against the fairing. This pad was left uninstalled for thousands of miles. You can see where the fairing has rubbed against the gas tank. Now we will remove the left fairing. Removal of the left fairing is pretty much the same as the right fairing, minus the 3 large rivets at the bottom that hold the 2 fairings together. To remove the left fairing, we must first remove the left side cover. There is 1 Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And 2 more hex bolts near the front of the bike. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it's removed from its threads. Take the nut plate off and put it in your organizer so it doesn't get lost. As with the right fairing, there are 3 small plastic rivets that secure the radiator fairing against the side and front fairings. You will only need to remove the lower 2. The 3rd upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab. These wires are not easy to detach, so you may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. It is possible to replace the headlight bulbs without removing the radiator fairing, but because access to the bulbs is much easier with the radiator fairing removed, and because it will provide better lighting and camera angles, I'll remove the radiator fairing. There are two Phillips head bolts that connect the radiator fairing with the mounting bracket. There are two rivets that connect the radiator fairing with the upper fairing. First, deactivate the rivet by pushing in the center with a pencil or screwdriver. Then the rivet can easily be removed with fingernails. Then remove the radiator fairing by pulling it towards the rear of the bike and then down. As you can see, it is possible to remove the headlight bulbs without removing the upper fairing. But to provide easier access and better camera angles, I'll remove the upper fairing. To remove the upper fairing, we must first remove the windshield because the two lower bolts that secure the shield join it with the upper fairing in a mounting bracket. Remove the four bolts that secure the windshield. Note that the two lower bolts are longer than the upper bolts. Each bolt has a nylon washer. Make sure that the two rubber well nuts that the top screws go into are not lost or damaged. They cost about $3 each to replace. The bottom screws have well nuts also, but the well nuts are seated on the mounting bracket and will not come up with the windshield. If you're interested in how these well nuts work, here's a diagram. The rubber has metal threading inside it that the bolts screw into. As the bolt rotates in the threads, the end of the well nut moves inward, flaring out the rubber and creating a tight seal on the surface. This tight seal dampens vibration of the windshield and prevents water from passing through. It's best to disconnect the headlights before we forget. There are two large hex bolts on either side of the bottom of the upper fairing. And there are two large hex bolts near the top of the fairing. The service manual says that you must remove these two bottom bolts also to remove the upper fairing. But on this model, it's not necessary to remove these two bottom bolts. The bolts have large washers. can now remove the upper fairing. Spread the sides of the fairing out a little so that they can clear the bolt holes and bracket holes. The rubber well nuts for the two lower windshield bolts are seated here. And here. This metal frame is where the two large hex bolts fit into at the top of the fairing. And these lower parts of the frame are where the two lower large hex bolts fit into. This is the back of the instrument cluster, the speedometer cable, and the headlight wires. We will now replace the headlight bulb. Begin by removing the dust cover. There are two tabs on the cover which you can use to pull it off. To remove the headlight bulb, disengage the locking bracket by pushing it out of its slot like so. Then pull the black adapter along with the attached bulb out of the upper fairing. Try not to bump or touch the bulb. A dirty bulb will have reduced functionality and, according to the service manual, may explode. Remove the bulb from the adapter. Again, try not to touch the bulb with bare hands. There's information about bulb replacement below the dust covers. As you can see, Kawasaki calls for the same bulb for both the high and low beams, an H7 12-volt 55-watt bulb. You can also find specifications on the bulb itself. These types of bulbs should be available at AutoZone or O'Reilly's, but you can get them cheaper on Amazon. As you can see, Amazon claims that these bulbs will fit the 2011 Ninja 250. Philips offers single bulbs. Install the new bulb in the adapter. Remember to avoid touching the bulb with bare hands or getting it dirty. When inserting the bulb and adapter in the upper fairing, make sure that this tab fits into its slot. Insert the adapter and bulb into the upper fairing. Close and engage the locking bracket like so. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get it onto its slot. Install the dust cover. Make sure that the cover pops into place around its entire perimeter. Then push the center of the dust cover onto the adapter until the entire perimeter is sealed. The headlight bulb is now installed. Replacement of the other bulb is the same procedure. We're now ready to install the removed parts. We will start by installing the upper fairing. Make sure that this tab fits into its rectangular hole. The hole on this side of the bike was damaged, probably when the bike was backed into by one of 7 cars. Notice the other tabs too. Install the 2 large hex bolts at the bottom of the upper fairing. And install the 2 large hex bolts near the top of the fairing. These 2 bolts have washers. Connect the headlights. The upper fairing is now installed. Install the windshield. Be sure that the well nuts on the upper holes are not lost or damaged. They dampen vibration and prevent water from passing through. Be sure that the tip of the windshield is placed above this tab on the upper fairing. Not below the tab, as in this shot. Install the 4 bolts. The longer bolts should be installed in the bottom holes. Be gentle when installing these bolts. The well nuts can rip, and they cost about $3 each. If you hear a buzzing noise near the windshield while riding your bike, you may want to tighten the windshield bolts, but don't over-tighten. Now install the radiator fairing. The Phillips head bolts go into the holes on this bracket. Be sure that the radiator fairing is properly positioned before installing the rivets and bolts. Install the 2 rivets. As demonstrated previously, install the rivet with the centerpiece in the raised position. After the rivet has been installed, push the centerpiece in to activate the rivet. Install the 2 Phillips head bolts. The radiator fairing is now installed. We will now install the left fairing. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the left fairing. Make sure that the bottom part of the fairing is positioned under the side stand. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. Position the tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. The upper tab on this motorcycle was snapped off. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the two lower rivets which connect the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Install the rivets in the open position. Then push the middle piece into place. Install the nut plate. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signals. Installation is the same for the right fairing, minus the three large rivets which serve to connect the right and lower fairing together. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the right fairing. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. This well nut is not installed properly. Position the two tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the 2 lower rivets which connect the radiator fairings with the side fairing. Install the rivets with the middle pieces in the raised position. Then push the middle pieces into place. Install the nut plate. This nut plate is clamped on tightly and was not removed. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signal wires. Install the 3 large rivets that connect the right and left fairings together. Install the rivets with the middle parts in the raised position, or completely removed. Then push the inner part of the rivets into place. And the second rivet. And the third rivet. Install the right side cover. Insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets. Each side cover has a Phillips head bolt. Install the bolt. Install the left side cover, insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets, and install the Phillips head bolt. This concludes headlight bulb replacement on a 2011 Ninja 250.